YouTube. My name is Elizabeth. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. I have a double book review for you today. I have read two nonfiction books, two new releases from 2022, and I want to talk about them. So one of them is The Facemaker by Lindsay Fitzharris. This one is about plastic surgery during World War I. And the other one is The Pope at War by David I. Kertzer. And the Pope in question is Pius XII, and the war in question is World War II. So I'm going to start with The Facemaker because I think of the two works as the one that is more popular, that is more geared towards the general public. It's more a work of popular fiction, popular history. So the subtitle of this book is A Visionary Surgeon's Battle to Mend the Disfigured Soldiers of World War I. So this book is about Harold Gillies, Gillies. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Gillies. So this doctor, he was one of the pioneers of plastic surgery. What happened in World War I is that it was a new type of war. It was trench war, and it was a war of artillery also. It was the first one that was on that scale. And the fact that it was a trench war, when you think about it, means that the face is probably the most exposed part of the body, because when you are sort of in a dug, you're sort of under the ground. When you start to attack, the first thing that appears above the ground is your face. And when artillery shoots stuff, it comes from the sky. So if you're in the trench, it's your head that's going to get hit. So there were quite many wounds to the face. But the state of surgery at the time was such, of medicine in general, was such that the soldiers survived these very gruesome injuries. In 30 years earlier, they would have died. But now in 1914 to 1918, they survived these horrible injuries like jaws shattered and nose ripped off and just cheekbones shattered and holes in the middle of the face and things like that. And what happened was that most doctors, most surgeons at the front were simply not prepared. They were not equipped to treat these wounds. And it's the type of wound that takes a lot of time to, well, not so much to heal, because that's what was happening. The surgeons at the front, all they did was clean up the wound, sew the things together, sew the skin, and just let the soldier go. And of course, what happened after that was that the face was just not functional. Some could not open their mouths, some could not speak, some could not eat. They looked so disfigured that it was obvious these soldiers would never find their place in society after the war, because there was still a big stigma against scars at the time. Disfigurement was very much associated with evil and things like that. So Gillies was one of the first to realize that appearances were very important, that it was important to repair these faces, not just to make sure that the soldier didn't die, but to repair and make the face functional again. That means to make sure that the soldiers could eat, could speak, and could express themselves with their face. They could smile or frown or things like that, that they would be basically recognized as humans. They would have human faces. So what makes this book very interesting is the main character, I keep calling real people characters. I don't know if I can do that, but historical figures. So the historical figure of Harold Gillies, he's a very interesting person because he is a very caring person. And that is just so nice to read about that, about a doctor who cares genuinely about the welfare of his patients, and not just about his reputation or about how great he is, but really cares about how well his patients are doing. And it's just a joy to read about that. Now, of course, the topic is not always super happy. He does lose a few patients because it's still the beginning. There's a bit of medical talk. At first, I was hoping for more of it because at first it was very broad, very general. And then the medical talk started and I thought, okay, it's just enough. I don't want any more because they talk about skin flaps and grafts and things like that. And it's just not the sort of things that I really enjoy necessarily. But I was glad for the information because we sometimes take for granted the state of medicine today, all the wonderful things that surgeons can do, but it had to start somewhere. And World War I was really a laboratory for plastic surgery, for not so, well, experimenting a little bit, but to learn a lot more about it, simply because of sheer quantity, because it was the first time that so many faces needed to be repaired and rebuilt, because plastic surgery apparently used to exist. But then again, surgery was something quite rare, because before anesthetics, surgery was not very fun. Not that it was much more fun in 1914 or today, but it was even worse, let's say, in the Middle Ages. So at least in 1914, you had hopes of surviving a surgery, because we had discovered the importance of clean instruments and things like that. We had finally understood the sources of infection, and we also had a beginning of anesthetics. I don't think we had a lot in terms of painkillers, but at least there was something. So these soldiers who were completely disfigured had to go through dozens of surgeries, sometimes over several months, several years, and it makes for a fascinating topic. So I think we're going to see this book in the BookTube Prize next year. I wouldn't be surprised. I'd be a bit disappointed if it wasn't there. The second book is The Pope at War. So this one I don't think will be in the BookTube Prize, because I don't think it's as much aimed at the general, well, it is aimed at the general public, but it's not as much a piece of popular fiction, because this book goes back to the sources. The point of this research is really to bring a new light on Pius XII and World War II. Because for a long time there was an official storyline by the Vatican that the Pope had done all that he could, even though it was not very much apparent in the back channels, in diplomacy. He did everything that he could to save Jews, to save everyone during World War II. However, there were doubts, because publicly he did so little that it was hard to believe that underneath he did more. So in 2020, finally, the archives were open, because some of it had been released gradually over the years, but most of it were still under wraps. But in 2020, the archives of Pius XII were finally open to researchers. And David Kertzer is one of them. And he used these new documents to tell the story of what the Pope did from 1939 to 1935. So this is really the period the book is concerned with, because Pius XII remained Pope until 1958. There's also questions about what he did to help Nazis and various high-ranking fascists escape justice after World War II, how the Vatican helped these people escape to South America, let's say, or things like that. It's not covered at all in the book. It stops in 1945. So it's really just the period of the war, 1939 to 1945. And the portrait that comes out of this book of the Pope, it's not flattering at all. There was one word that came to mind. To me, it came in French. It was pusillanime. And in English, apparently, it's pretty much the same word. It is pusillanimous. That means somebody who is afraid of risk, who is averse to risk, who is basically cowering whenever there's a risk. And that is very much Pius XII. He was always thinking in terms of what he could lose. He never thought of when I say he, I don't mean him personally. I don't think himself he was particularly self-involved. I mean the church, the Catholic Church. He was always thinking of what the Catholic Church could lose. Because when you think about it, in, let's say, 1940, what was the situation? In 1940, you had Germany and Italy were part of the Axis. Italy was 100% Catholic, or almost, and Germany was in very large part Catholic too. If you include Austria, Bavaria, and all southern Germany, there were millions of Catholics in Germany. So the basis for how can I say, the countries that would look to the Vatican normally were very much under Axis power. Because in 1940, the other Catholic countries in Europe, there was France, who was already beaten by Germany, Poland, already beaten by Germany, and then the other Catholic countries were neutral. Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, they were not part of the war. So we can understand that at the beginning of the war, if you're thinking about the survival of the church, you think you have no choice, you have to comply with Hitler and Mussolini, because they are the masters of Catholic Europe. And then by 1942, let's say, you could start to feel the tide of the war changing. Of course, it was not perhaps very obvious in 1942 because it's the US that made the biggest difference, and also the USSR that were now belligerents in the war. The US, its impact has not been felt fully by 1942 because the war effort started at the very end of 1941. So by 1942, they were still finding new soldiers, still producing planes, producing tanks, producing weapons. So it was not, the war machine was not at its highest level. And the same thing can be said of the USSR, because when they got invaded in 1941, Barbarossa, yeah, 1941, the USSR was not prepared either. So by the time that the war machines got on and the production started, the factories started producing weapons and things like that, it took a little while. So in 1942, perhaps it was not quite clear, but the tide was changing in 1942, and by 1943, it was obvious that the tide was changing. But for the Pope, it was not necessarily good news because, as I said, the Axis were very much the Catholic countries, and both the United States and the USSR were not necessarily allies, natural allies of the Vatican. In fact, the USSR for the Vatican, it was the worst because communism was a real menace to the church. And the United States were not inclined to stay in Europe necessarily. It was very much thought that the United States would go back to their isolationist positions and just not be concerned themselves with the situation of Europe, so that they would leave, and that would mean that the USSR would be the dominating power in Europe. And that was very scary for the Pope. So all of this to say that the Pope almost, I'm not saying that he really wished a victory of the Axis, but the Pope could have lived with a victory of the Axis. So what did the Pope do for the Jews? According to the Pope, he's convinced that he did all that he could. And there's a sentence, a paragraph, I'm going to read it to you. The Pope, every year the Pope makes an address, a radio address for Christmas. And in 1942, on the 24th page of the Pope's text were words that defenders of Pius XII would later cite in trying to cast the speech as a ringing papal denunciation of the ongoing massacre of Europe's Jews. Okay, I have to mention that by 1942, the Pope knew what was going on. He had received numerous reports, and not just by governments like diplomats from the United States or from Britain trying to tell him what was going on the other side of the war. From his own people, from priests, from bishops, they had sent reports from Poland, from Slovakia, from Romania, from plenty of places where Jews were massacred, where villages and cities were emptied of their Jews. The Jews were shipped God knows where, and no one ever returned. So the Pope knew perfectly well what was going on by Christmas 1942. So, although the Pope nowhere mentioned either Nazis or Jews, he lamented in that well-buried passage the, opening quotes, hundreds of thousands of people who through no fault of their own and solely because of their nation or their race have been condemned to death or progressive extinction, end of quote. In his end-of-the-year report, Osborne, that is a British diplomat, recalled that the Pope seemed pained and surprised that the words had not satisfied those who had been calling on him to speak out. Opening quotes from Osborne, while the address strikes me as being the most effective of the Pope's recent pronouncements, it suffers from the usual defect of exorbitant length and from the fact that his teachings are weakened by the oratorial flux in which they are invariably enveloped. End of quote. So basically, the Pope thought that these few words of saying that thousands of people through no fault of their own have been victim of extinction, something like that, or the target of extinction, that these few words on page 24 of his speech were a ringing denunciation, and the Pope did not understand that people did not understand that. And that's another aspect of the Pope that comes out in this book. That's a man very much of diplomacy. Before he became Pope, he worked in diplomacy. He represented the Vatican in Germany for many, many years, and he knew German society very well. He spoke German, and he had basically a lot of affinities with German culture. And another thing that comes out is that this Pope, who is so used to diplomacy, does not understand people. So I think that's one of the reasons why he was so intimidated by, so preoccupied by Mussolini and Hitler and the governments. It's that he did not understand that he could connect with the people directly without going through Hitler or Mussolini. By the way, both Mussolini and Hitler technically were Catholics, so both of them could have been excommunicated. The Pope never did that. He never excommunicated anyone involved in the massacres of the Jews or in any sort of systematic discrimination. He never did that. What he could have done was to not necessarily excommunicate, but threaten, just remind that any Catholic involved in the persecution of Jews would have to face their maker and would not be well received, let's say. He could just have said something like that. The church does not look well upon people who participate in the persecution of Jews. And suddenly Hitler would have found a lot of difficulty to find people willing to do the job, because in Poland it was the Catholics who murdered the Jews. They participated, even though they for years and years they blamed, oh, it's the Germans, the Germans. It was very much Polish workers who manned the camps and who rounded up the Jews and who were policing the Jews. So Catholics were involved in there. Same thing in Germany. Okay, half of Germany was Protestants, but the other half was Catholic. So it was Catholics who were doing that. And same thing in France. It was Catholics who were doing that. So if there had been a ringing denunciation of saying, Catholics, please, if you want to remain good Catholics, don't do it, he could have done it. But he never did it because he never understood that. That's something that comes out from the book. It's that a man who is concerned with governments, with official channels of power, he does not understand the power of the people. And that's a reason to fear democracies in a way. In a way, he was more comfortable dealing with Mussolini and Hitler than he was afterwards dealing with Roosevelt and Churchill, because he does not understand democracy. So after Italy was liberated, mainly by Americans, the Pope lamented the fact that newspapers were not censored anymore, that movies were not censored anymore. The Pope had a problem with free speech because under Mussolini, if the Pope complained that, let's say, that movie is too sexy, it's not good for the morals of the population, Mussolini would kindly oblige and say, okay, that movie will be, well, that scene will be taken out, or that movie will not be shown, or anything like that. There was clearly an affinity of Mussolini with censorship, and the Pope, they understood censorship. And then democracy arrives, and the Pope does not quite get it. So this Pope was always afraid of losing things, and he did not realize that the church was losing its soul when it was by doing nothing. Because that's another thing that I somewhat discovered in this book, that anti-Semitism was official dogma of the Catholic Church for a very long time. I really didn't know that. I knew that the church had never been kind to Jews, and that at least until the Middle Ages or until the Renaissance, that there was a lot of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic feeling in the church, and that it was official policy. But I didn't know that it remained official policy until the 1960s, until the Second Vatican Council by John the 23rd. So in a way, I can almost understand that the Pope didn't do anything, didn't mention anything about the Jews, because basically, okay, extermination is not right, but separation is not necessarily wrong. I think, I have to think that he thought from the point of view of the Catholic Church that in a way, the persecution of Jews, I guess, was not that bad. As long as killing them was a bit too much, but taking them to ghettos was not necessarily bad. It's very troubling to read that. But it's not necessarily, I don't think it's the anti-Semitic nature of the Catholic Church that made it so silent during World War II. I don't think that was the source of it. I think it was really that the Pope did not have the courage to do anything about it. One thing that he tried to do very much was to change the racial laws so that baptized Jews could be considered Christians. Because of course, according to the German laws and the Italian laws, it was not the baptism, it was not your religion that counted, it was your birth. So if you had a Jewish parent or Jewish grandparents, you were a Jew by race. So it was not a question of religion, it was a question of race. And of course, for the Pope, that meant nothing. It's really strictly a question of religion. So if you were a convert, you were not a Jew anymore, you were a Catholic, and you should have been protected. And the Pope very much tried to have the laws changed, but the laws never really changed. And he did try to save a few baptized Jews here and there. So in his mind, he was not saving Jews, he was saving Catholics. So it's another thing that makes the Pope not very a savory character, is that he wasn't trying to save Jews, he was trying to save Catholics. And yeah, so basically, the Pope is not, the Pope Pius XII is not the nicest person to ever have been Pope, I guess. I think he was the man, he was not the man for this situation. It's another case of a man put in a situation that he couldn't deal with. He didn't have the personality to deal with it. He didn't know how to face the situation. He did the best that he could, but it just wasn't good enough, in my opinion. And another thing is that I realized that I need to read more about Pius XII, because this book is very much focused on the politics of things. There's nothing about religion. And I have to suppose that during the 5 years, 6 years of the war, the Pope did do some things religion-wise, that he did take decisions on dogma and things like that, that he was not 100% focused on the political situation, and because that book is only concerned about that. And that gives an image of Pius XII as somebody who is as a bad pope because he doesn't have any spiritual life. Now, of course, that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is really just to look at the Pope and his relations with the Axis and with the democracies, and it's to look at the political side of the Pope's career during World War II, 1939 to 1945. But I think that means that there's something lacking. So the portrait of the Pope, in my opinion, is incomplete. And of course, it's not the focus of the book. So it just means that I need to read something else to get a better portrait of Pius XII, to get a better idea of the man. Because the man that appears in this book, the political man, is not very savvy and is not very... he's not a very savvy political leader, and that makes him a very bad religious leader at the same time. So yeah, anyway, I found this very interesting. It's very detailed. It's quite long. It's about 500 pages, plus a lot of text in the notes. The notes are interesting too. It's not just references to documents. There's material to read in the notes too. So it's quite a long read. I don't think this will make the Book 2 prize next year, but I think it's very interesting. So that is it. That's the 2 books that I read recently. If you read some recent nonfiction that you found very interesting, let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!